This is the Temperance 2. This is the original. Spyderco does have a very long history of introducing models, refining them extensively with user feedback. And you can see aspects of that in the evolution of the Temperance design. But I think arguably you can also see it moved from a different class of knife. The original Temperance was very much a worker class knife, no frills type of design. The newer Temperance is more of a presentation piece grade knife. Now, I'm not talking about presentation piece as in from somebody like Kevin Cashin. I'm just talking about moving from a worker grade piece to a higher end piece, visuals and materials, such as the micarta handle slabs. The interesting thing about the new Temperance is that it's very balanced in terms of things that I would like to have against things that I prefer in the older design, which makes it very much a toss-up for me. And it's also very easy to see how someone could easily prefer one of the knives over the other. Because although the properties themselves are very objective, it's subjective how much they're actually valued. The sheath itself has a much larger area simply because it's larger outside the print of the blade. The blade itself is roughly the same size. The actual clip has changed dramatically. The old ones had the big bulk tech lock. The new ones have a very minor, a very small little clip that's still multi-position through the holes on the bottom and sides, so it can be rotated and turned around the same way. In regards to the handle, they are quite different in terms of construction. This is full tang slab micarta handles. This is basically sort of an injection plastic partial tang construction that has a massive difference in terms of the weight of the knife. The new one is much heavier. The handle on the older one is also much more predominantly swelled in both thickness and width, and in regards to the forward guard and the end bird beak, and even has basically a recessed cut in the thumb ramp on the end for maximum control and security. The newer grip is much flatter and has far less contouring. I would describe it as fully chamfered. There are no square spots on the grip. However, the older grip I wouldn't say is chamfered, I would say it's round. It is much more comfortable in the way it fits in the hand because, again, this is a flattish style grip which has been chamfered at the edges. This is fully contoured. Now, of course, the downside of doing a grip like this is these dramatic swells give it an overall much bigger print, because the thickest that it is in any given area is how essentially flat it actually rides against you or in a pack or whatever, and the new one is much flatter in that respect. The older one is also dramatically more secure in terms of moving forward or moving back, because again the front guard and the bird's beak at the end are much more pronounced because they flare sideways as well as vertically, up or down. The new one though does bring a number of advantages. The older style handle was very difficult to use in a pinch grip because of that dramatic flare through the width. The new one is very comfortable in forward grips because it doesn't have that dramatic flare. So the new one is much easier to control for point work, for precision cutting, and even just to choke up on the blade to sort of neutralize the weight to do deeper slices. The dimples on the old style handle were always one of those things that people either loved or they absolutely hated. I generally didn't like them that much. I found them annoying more than anything else, and they are slightly abrasive. but some people actually love them, and they know they give you the ability to know exactly where your fingers are on the blade of all time, because of course they fit right into those holes. Both of them have a rear drilled hole for a lanyard. The biggest difference that the construction makes in terms of performance in regards to the handle is that the full slab design of the new one makes it much heavier. And if you do like Luco style chopping, which I don't for safety reasons, and I don't think in general it's actually more efficient, using a lanyard at the end and a two-fingered grip with snap cuts, you can get a tremendous amount more power on the new one versus the old one, again just because it's much heavier. The problem is with doing those sort of snap cuts, it's not like you have the control that you have when you're chopping with an actual full-size blade. So here's a Hudson Bay Camp from Gamma brand, and this knife easily chops with an actual forward grip, and you have excellent control, so excellent precision, accuracy, and your rate of glancing, turning, twisting goes much down, so it's much safer and much more efficient. When you're flailing away with a smaller blade, you have very little ability to control the blade moving around in the swing, because again you're just sort of pinching it on the end, and again you get much less accuracy and precision. Your chops stagger all over the place. The only time I really actually do that is when I'm doing limbing or small cutting, where I can chop through something in essentially one hit, and I know I'm going to be able to do it. In that case it becomes useful. For thicker wood that I had to cut, rather than sort of flailing away, I would actually cross impact cut it by hitting the spine of the blade, or notch it again, or put the wood under tension and sort of cut through it. In regards to the blade, they are very similar, though there are a few differences. The older one had a much more pronounced ricasso. The newer one doesn't, and doesn't even have a sharpening notch. This allows you to cut much closer to the handle, so you get much better leverage. The downside is that the lack of the sharpening notch over time is going to most likely introduce a bit of a problem trying to keep this area right here fully sharp, unless you take measures and control to make sure that you do start sharpening right at that area. A bigger difference though is in the tips. The tip on the older Temperance had a much more pronounced distal taper, so the tip was much slimmer, so the penetration was higher. The downside though, of course, is that you lose strength over prying and other heavier work. You are more likely to snap off the tip on the Temperance. The newer one does have a more robust tip. Other than that though, the blades are very similar, and there are a few aesthetic differences. Of course, you can see the plunge was much squarish on the old one, where it has a much nicer dramatic flare, and the newer one does have the spider hole in it. And the other difference is that the thumb ramp is much more of a natural position on the new one, whereas on the old one it was much more abrupt. And this is a sort of a change from sort of a thumb ramp that's more for precision and control, whereas this one was more for security in the extremes and for a direct driving that you could actually lean into the thumb ramp. In regards to using it on wood and brushwork, the cutting ability is very high. It's easily comparable to a well-known benchmark such as this, which is the very well-used Mora 2000 standard single bevel blade. The reason that the cutting ability is comparable, of course, is that even though the angle on the Temperance is slightly higher than the angle normally found on your single bevel blades, which is usually around 9 to 10 degrees per side for the more inexpensive ones, the Temperance has a higher primary grind, or has a primary grind depending on what way you want to classify the blade grinds. So even though the edge has a slightly higher angle, it tapers much faster. So you will find it takes a little bit more force to go into the wood, and you need to use a higher angle to cut into the wood. once you start getting into it, the force doesn't increase as rapidly as it does with a Mora. But that difference really is only significant for short-term cutting. If you do a lot of cutting, like as in, you know, hundreds of cuts, you will see a difference in regards to comfort and fatigue and efficiency, because handles such as what's found on the Mora 2000 don't spare any expense in regards to making them comfortable. So this again is a handle which I would not describe as chamfered. I would describe it as fully rounded. It is again flared in both the thickness and in the width, and there's no discomfort with this. With the Temperance, again, it's a flattish style handle which is chamfered and slightly rounded. So you start doing a little bit of work and you will feel, yeah, it's comfortable, there's no hot spots, but after a couple of hundred, you move into 1,000 type passes, you will feel that even though it is chamfered, you're not making the full smooth contact area that you will on something like a Mora. So you do get little tiny bits of discomfort build up in your hand. But again, that takes long term. You're talking about, you know, sort of 1,000 type cuts. One of the bigger differences comes from the actual steel type itself. VG10 is a relatively high carbide steel, and a high percentage of carbides leaves very thin cross sections, like in the tip and in the edge, relatively weak. And that's because, of course, those very thin cross sections are not much bigger than the carbides, so when they start to flex, they will tend to break relatively easy compared to similar or even thinner cross sections on steels that have lower carbide volumes. So for example, while I would rigorously pry thicker barks off with the Mora 2000, and in the case I do eventually end up overloading it, you will just put a slight bend in the tip of the blade. But if you start doing heavier work like that with a high carbide steel, at some point you'll just crack a piece off the tip with very little warning. So that's one of the downsides to the higher carbide steels. And the other downside is, of course, the grindability. When you do much heavier work outside, you often, of course, you're not going to be washing the woods that you're working with. So any dirt or grit in the wood does blunt the steel significantly, and it's easier to grind on a lower carbide steel. Now, interestingly enough, if you compare the Temperance and say the Mora 2000 in that respect, the Mora 2000 has a much higher grindability, so it is easier to remove material from it, but it has this very, very wide bevel, so you need to remove more of it. And I found that almost balances itself out dramatically. If I use boat knives for some heavier cutting and do need to end up restoring them, it takes similar periods of time. Again, though, the more it grinds easier, you have more grinding to do because the bevel is much wider, which is in general why I don't prefer this single very wide bevel, because it reduces performance in that area and in other areas. So I generally only keep a couple of knives like this for stock performance and benchmarks, and for my actual user knives I always grind these down full height grinds and just leave the edge at whatever thickness that's functional for the knife. So overall, I think about this as a knife that you can use very capably for woodworking, in comparison to something like the Mora 2000, which is not a knife you can use capably. It's a knife which is designed to do that stuff very well. But you will again only tend to notice that difference if you have to do a lot of the cutting. You're not going to notice it if you're just making a few steaks, if you're just cutting a few pieces of wood, and if you're just doing a light bit of carving. In regards to working in the kitchen, the Temperance works very well. It is almost sort of approaching a dropped blade profile. Now, it doesn't have a fully dropped blade like you will see on this, which is the ErgoSlice from Rugg. And this is almost sort of a heavier, relatively thick stock, short chef's knife, and works very well in that respect. and the drop blade allows you to get your hand much closer to the cutting board, and you don't need to use such exaggerated forward angles. In comparison, the Mora 2000 becomes sort of awkward for any of that kind of work because there is no clearance. The blade is actually up much higher. So it's essentially a very wide paring knife. Works well for as a short butcher knife the same way, but has very little ability to use as a chef's knife. And when you're working with it on a cutting board, you're using this very exaggerated angle and you're only cutting with the forward section. In comparison, again, the Temperance doesn't have the actual drop blade profile that you'd see in a chef's knife, but again, it's closer to that than a lot of utility outdoor style knives, so it's much more friendly for use in the kitchen. And again, very thin edge, relatively acute edge angle. The only thing that really slows it down is that eventually on deeper cuts, cabbages, turnips, watermelons, that type of work, you will see binding on very deep cuts, again because the blade stock is relatively thick. But on shorter type work, like where you're doing shallow cuts into carrots, green onions, and anything which is easy to cut, like apples and tomatoes, the performance is relatively high because you're mainly looking at then the characteristics of the edge itself, because that's where the force is around. It gets a bit awkward for paring and peeling type work because the blade is so wide, and the Mora 2000 is better there because again the more narrow blade allows you to turn easier. So for peeling potatoes, peeling turnips, popping the ends off carrots where you're sort of doing scallopy cuts, Mora is a better blade. And you will find the fatigue is slightly higher on the Temperance because the blade is so wide. It's more awkward when you're peeling potatoes, and especially on the larger vegetables, again, like turnips. Now again, when I'm talking about this doing well in the kitchen, I'm comparing it to knives of its sort of class and style. If you actually compare it to an actual kitchen knife, like this, which is a very nice example in super blue, it's not in the same class, and the Temperance becomes clumsy and awkward in comparison. This is a very nice example of a design which uses a bolster but still preserves the very fine heel of a bolsterless design. So here's a bolsterless design, and that of course leaves this heel that gives you full length cutting ability and full length ease of sharpening. Many bolstered designs like this one bring the bolster down, cover up the actual heel of the blade. You can't cut full length because this thing is not even sharp, and you'll end up with an area here which over time, unless you're very careful, becomes relatively blunt, and it will even develop a bit of a recurve if you're trying to sharpen right down to the end. Some people like this for looks, and some people even like this for a bit of a striking surface, sort of a pseudo hammer. I generally don't like doing that, especially when the edge is very fine. Hammering on with that little bit of a bolster, if you don't hit it exactly, you can smash that edge into something which would not be pleasant. So of course, going back to this design, which I said again is in super blue, you have the aesthetics of a bolster. You have the ability to manipulate the weight and balance with a bolster, but you preserve the very sharp cutting ability of the heel and ease of sharpening of a bolsterless design. So if I wanted a bolster, which I generally don't like, I'd go for a design like this. As a general utility knife, I've always liked the Temperance. This is one that I've had for a very, very long time. I eventually had thickened the edge to the point that it was well over 1/8 of an inch wide, and I reground the primary so it's less than 5,000 stick at the shoulder or right behind the secondary bevel. The new one, again, much the same. The only thing to keep in mind, again, it's heavier than the older model, so it's a bit more awkward for precision type work, especially when you're trying to work with the tip, because you have to try to counterbalance the weight of the knife, and that's where sort of picking the knife that more suits the task becomes a bit of an issue. Because while larger style knives, and here's a very nice one, this is a Spartan from Gavko. work very well in general for brush cutting. Trying to use them for lighter utility work can be a bit awkward because the point is so far in front of the blade. You have a leverage disadvantage when you're doing any cutting with it, and trying to choke up on the blade. There's so much of the handle behind the blade that it's a bit of an issue. And that's one of the downsides of wood. I absolutely love wood, love the way that it looks, love the way that it handles, but there are fragility aspects with wood, and a piece of this handle actually broke away with relatively moderate contact when I was using it over the winter. And again, cold makes everything a bit more brittle, but that's not a tremendous issue. I'll just sand this off. But you won't see things like that, of course, with micarta and G10 and the other materials, because they're just on a whole other level in terms of durability and the benefits of them. On the other end of the spectrum, you have something like this, which is a very small knife from Udo. He's a knife maker. He's on YouTube. This knife is so small and so lightweight that it's almost weightless in hand. I mean, I can hold this by a pinch grip with my thumb and index finger alone, and the rest of my hand sort of just stabilizes it, and I have scalpel-like ability to work with the tip for very fine cuts. You obviously can't do that with the Temperance because there's that much weight behind it. You actually need to lift up and stabilize the blade, so your rate of fatigue is much higher. There's no fatigue when working with a knife of this size and work that's suitable to it, because it's, like I said, weightless, and the control and precision is just so dramatically high, it becomes a pleasure to use for light utility work. Now, of course, it doesn't have the weight and the length and the reach for the heavier work, but you compare this to the Temperance on smaller utility work, and again, it shows the dramatic difference that picking a knife suitable to the work can actually make. VG10 came on strongly a few years ago, and it was one of the first market saturation steels. S30V and ATS34 before VG10 are also examples of market saturation steels. But what I mean by that is they come on and then all of a sudden you see them everywhere. Over a tremendous scope of knives, and you see them in very different areas by very different makers and very different styles of knives. And that came on. ATS34 swept through knife making. VG10, not as dramatic, but still there, used for, you know, your utility style knives. It's one of the primary steels Spyderco uses. It's used in high-end kitchen cutlery. This is sort of a Henkel's Japanese blend, which uses VG10. And it's used in some very heavy survival type knives that Falk Kniving uses as well. One of the nicer things about VG10 is that while it's clearly a step up from sort of the class 1 type steels, like your 420J2 Chicago Cutlery, or your plain carbon steels. This is a Bushman from Cold Steel, again left at a moderate type hardness. And if you do abrasive cutting with that and abrasive cutting cardboard ropes with sort of VG10, you will notice a difference. And the difference is large enough that you do not need to do a tremendous amount of exacting comparisons. Usually most people who would use those knives side by side would see a rather large difference between VG10 and a 420J2, or VG10 and a 1050 steel, again at about 55 Rockwell for the 1050 and around 59 to 61 for a VG10. So you're often looking at hardness differences of 5 to 10 Rockwell points, and more significantly differences in the microstructure, because again this is used in a higher end knife, so you have a high percentage of martensite formation, you have better quenching and better tempering control, and usually cryogenics or multiple hot tempers. But the nice thing about VG10, and while it has that sort of advantage that it does withstand abrasive cutting and can hold that lower sharpness at a longer level of time, the carbide volume is not that high that it becomes difficult to sharpen, where you need specialty abrasives to sharpen it, or that people complain about the grindability. And these are frequent issues that come up on steels like ZDP 189 or S90V, and they are more abrasion resistant than VG10, but they're to the point where that people generally will not sharpen them on inexpensive stones, and they often complain about issues with grindability, and especially if they have to reset the bevels. As I mentioned earlier, this knife is very well used, years and years of use. The edge had thickened and widened out, and I reground the primary to get the edge under 5 thousandths thick again. And after I did that, I used this, which is one of the cheapest and worst cutting stones that I have, and within literally like 30 seconds, the edge on the Temperance was to the point where it was just about to start doing a true 90 push cut on newsprint and could easily take hairs off the arm, but of course was a bit scratchy because again this is a very coarse stone and doesn't cut tremendously well, so it leaves a bit more of a burr than I would like, because of course the faster cutting stone, the more aggressive the stone is, the more cutting it will do on the edge and the less deformation. That's because the more deformation the stone does to the edge, the more burnishing, the more peening, and the greater the burr formation. VG10 is one of the benchmarks of Spyderco knives, and again performs very well in that area that it introduces people moving up from the lower level of steels in regards to wear and abrasion resistance, and in regards to hardening, because often when you buy a $5 knife, of course you can't expect much in terms of heat treatment. So they get these VG10 knives from Spyderco, and they are significantly harder. They form a crisper edge. They will actually even stay at a higher sharpness better than some of the simpler steels and the simpler knives, because of that 5 to 10 point Rockwell difference in inferior heat treatment. But they also are able to maintain that lower sharpness for a much longer period of time in abrasive cutting because of the higher carbide volume. And again, there's generally not really lots of complaints about it, because you can easily sharpen this on Arkansas stones or even cheapest dirt stones like I just had. So it's a very nice steel to introduce someone to sort of modern high carbide stainless steels without making them so difficult or so high carbide volume that people would have difficulties sharpening it. Whereas if you gave someone who was used to knives like this, and this is a 420 J2 blade, and all of a sudden you tried to jump them all the way up to this, which is an M390 blade, they would likely walk away thinking that the newer steels are relatively junk, because this steel is tremendously difficult to grind, and you do not want to try to do it on lesser quality stones. You want higher quality stones which have very sharp abrasives, which can cut much faster, and you also want a bit more skill and experience in picking the right grit of the stones, because even small mistakes are not very forgiving when you have such low grindability. In comparison, for blades like this, again cold steel Bushman, which are of moderate hardness and minimum carbide volume, you don't need to give much concern about what you start off with in terms of grit, because they grind so easily. You're doing very little time, even with a stone that doesn't in general cut very well. So overall, it's a very interesting knife. The only last thing that I will say about it is that the main complaint people have is about the price, and the thing that you have to look at there is what else is available in this price range. And because the price of this is on the sort of higher end, it is coming in focused comparisons with a lot of other blades that weren't strictly comparisons to the older Temperance, which was again at a lower price point.